Hi and welcome again. In this session, we're going to be talking about soteriology, or how we achieve salvation. And so, after going through the class and talking about evil and talking about the human problem and talking about other aspects of religions, now we're talking about what is salvation according to different religions, and how do you get there. And so, we'll be talking about the ways and the goals of salvation in this session. So there's actually three parts, broken out into three parts. And so you can take them at your leisure, but we are going to be focused on chapter 13, Ways and Goals of Salvation, from the Livingston Anatomy of the Sacred Text, and the PDF file is out on Moodle as well. This is a pretty large topic to cover in thinking about the different ways of salvation and liberation, and also the goals of salvation and liberation. And so really the online presentation is really just going to cover the ways of salvation and liberation. And we have these four different ways that we'll get into in a little bit. But students are responsible for the reading aspect of the goals of salvation. And this is where we get into a little bit different non-traditional religious understandings of salvation, where we talk about the psychic wholeness or restored social order. But this is something that if we think about sort of like the Messianic or utopian age, and something that the cults try to embrace, is this idea of like, okay, is there a different kind of psychic wholeness or different restored social order on Earth that we could achieve, some sort of utopian age, rather than waiting for some sort of external Deus Machina of like coming in and saving the world and everything like that. So and then also we have some Eastern approach with Samadhi, Nirvana, Sunyata. And so these are meditative. You can achieve these through some sort of meditative practices. Or if you practice yoga, this is sort of like the religious link of the physical practice of yoga. So things to achieve. So you can read about those on your own. The online presentation will cover the ways and of salvation and liberation in these four ways, and you can take care of the goals of these other goals on your own in the reading.
What is soteriology? Soteriology is essentially the study of salvation. It's studying the afterlife and how to get to the afterlife. Now, each religious tradition has its own sense of what constitutes the afterlife and how to go about getting there. And so we'll be looking at how the various religions look at, okay, what is the afterlife? What does it consist of? And also, how does an individual achieve salvation or achieve nirvana or achieve enlightenment? Now, one thing to note is that, and we looked at this in the chapter or the session on the human problem, is that life is burdened. Life is not easy. And we are searching for a way out of the challenges and out of the struggles of life, and that's why we look to a future life, to a future salvation, or we have a sense that something is not right. Something is just not right in our life, and that we seek some sort of solution to that tension that we find in our lives. And you can see here, these are two quotes. Human life is burdened by a tragic moral and spiritual discontent. And so often we're not fully happy. And how do we go about achieving that happiness? What kind of things do we need to do? And then also, life is marked by anxiety, estrangement, and a sense of failure, defilement, moral guilt, shame, pain, and unease. Why is this? Why is life marked by anxiety, by estrangement and sense of failure? Is that because that we think that there's something greater, or are we just inherently always thinking that the grass is greener, on the other side, and so we're always trying to find something that'll make us happier, whether that's money or items or better grades or better schools or children, or we're always looking for something to fill us up. But why is that? Why are we marked by anxiety, estrangement, and a sense of failure? Just a question that you should think about. And also, Nowadays, as this image on the bottom left shows, have we turned to drugs to solve anxiety? If religion is losing sway, is it going to be replaced by drugs? And so, even though religion may lose its influence over individual lives, if we still have this anxiety, estrangement, sense of failure, etc., is not going away, do we need to replace, some of the things that the role that religion provided? And so, is this in the bottom left? Is this what Freud had envisioned? And we move beyond the illusion of religion, but now people are diagnosed with anxiety disorders and taking Zoloft or Prozac or Paxil or so what do we do? But I think on the next slide I have an excerpt from Hamlet, and it just kind of shows, what do we do? How do we view life? And is his view of life consistent with your own, or how do you go about trying to overcome the anxiety or the sense of failure, the moral guilt, or the pain and unease that you've experienced in your own life? Here we have, this is taken from the Divine Comedy, the Paradiso, Gustave Doré's illustrations to the Divine Comedy. Many of you may have read the Divine Comedy, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, the Paradiso. But here you have Dante and Beatrice. Beatrice is his guide. Gaze upon the highest heaven. And there's also images of in the Inferno of all the rings of hell, but gazing the beatific vision, and gazing upon the God, and gazing upon the heaven. So I mean, this in art and in architecture, you find this notion of salvation and what salvation means. It's quite apparent, and it's quite popular in art because we don't know, and so imaginations run wild with trying to theorize about what constitutes the afterlife. And so, is it? Do you see? When you die, is there a vision that you encounter? Is there a light and a voice pulling you toward the light? So one interesting notion that I used to work and do research on. I wrote a paper on post-traumatic stress syndrome and how people would recover quicker from post-traumatic stress syndrome, those who have a religious worldview. And I looked at some interviews of people with near-death experiences, and these near-death experiences were validated by hospitals and saying yes, they were brain dead for a certain period of time. But what's most interesting about these near-death experiences is that the context of the patient informs their vision or informs their near-death experience. And so for Christians have a Christian near-death experience, or someone who is more familiar with Christianity. And so they're being, they see a Jesus, or Jesus is holding their hand and walking with them toward a light. But you don't have a lot of Christians experiencing a Hindu kind of near-death experience. But you do have, like with Muslims, they don't necessarily have Christian near-death experiences. They would actually have, a different one. And so it's interesting to think about that. It's like, well, what does that mean? And so regardless of what you think about, whether or not near-death experiences are actual near-death experiences and they've actually transcended their own body, or if it's just some sort of chemical production in the brain that's causing these visions. I mean, it's still interesting to note that the visions themselves are typically within the parameters of that particular person's belief system. So are there multiple salvations? Is there more than one heaven? I mean, it's kind of these questions to consider and kind of fun things to think about. So, but we find a lot of artistry though about the afterlife, because people do have their imagination and try to use some of the religious teachings, but it's not clear because no one knows. So moving on. So we'll be looking at 4 ways of salvation that can be found in the traditional religions. The first is the way of faith through grace. And we'll focus primarily on Martin Luther and some of his changes and his insights into Christianity that were the basis of the Protestant Reformation, which was the root of all Protestantism. Secondly, the way of devotion, which is found in a number of different religions. Thirdly, way of disciplined action. We'll look at Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism. And then finally, the way of meditation and insight. So these paths are usually combined. So it's important to note that one path, that a religion doesn't necessarily focus on just one of these paths. For example, in Christianity or in Protestant Christianity, the way of faith through grace, also incorporates, a way of disciplined action. So these paths are usually combined, especially the first 3 are combined within a religious tradition. But there, certain, say like Luther's notion of faith through grace, you can say it's like, well, it pushes this first way of salvation. So these are the 4 ways of salvation we'll be examining.